So there's been rumors about the Final Fantasy IX remake possibly getting canceled in the future, despite the fact that this year marks the 25th anniversary of the game, which came out back in 2000. And for those who don't know, Final Fantasy IX came out on the PS1 back on July 7th, 25 years ago. But it's a game that people really don't talk about as much compared to the likes of Final Fantasy 7 or 12 or 10 or 15 or 6 or the older titles in general. And I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe it's because the main protagonist is not as popular as some of the other main protagonists. And um and you look at Final Fantasy 9, it also had artwork that was unlike the other entries that we got that came before and after it, which made Final Fantasy 9 stand out more so than ever. And people didn't really have problems with like the storytelling or the gameplay or anything like that. I feel like the aesthetics was something that it took a while for people to get used to that, but at the same time, for the most part, people think that Final Fantasy IX was one of the better entries that we got during the 2000s decade. But I do feel like Final Fantasy IX got overshadowed by Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy X Part 2, along with Final Fantasy 12. And I honestly feel like, for the most part, like Final Fantasy IX came out during a time period where the series was within its golden era, in my opinion, because a lot of people would go on record and say that the golden era was during the SNES days. I beg to differ. I would say the golden era for the Final Fantasy series was during like the late 90s, early 2000s, during the PS1, PS2 era. And I feel like by the time we got the PS3, it started to become irrelevant because a lot of people didn't care too much about Final Fantasy 13 parts 1 and 2. And then Final Fantasy 14 was a mess when it first came out. Final Fantasy 15 is looked at as overrated, even though the game has been around for like 9 years now. And yeah, I honestly feel like Final Fantasy IX was one of the last few entries where people were still like paying attention to the series as a whole. And I'm not talking about hardcore fans of the series, I'm talking about casuals as well. And the game did like 5.5 million in terms of sales on the PS1. So obviously the game was a big deal, back in the day. Even though it didn't sell as much as Final Fantasy 7 and 8, a lot of people were still paying attention to the franchise as a whole. And honestly, I do feel like a Final Fantasy 9 remake would be a bigger deal than Final Fantasy 16 because a lot of people have quickly forgotten about Final Fantasy 16 altogether. And I'm not exactly sure whether or not, people just don't care about the series anymore, or whether or not, making Final Fantasy, M rated was something that ended up biting Square Enix in the backside in the long run. Either way, I do feel like Final Fantasy IX was definitely one of their better yet underrated games that we got back in the day, and it's something that shouldn't be canceled. And as far as the cancellation rumors are concerned, I've read about it on different gaming sites, whether it be Game Rant, whether it be Screen Rant. There's been a lot of speculation regarding the Final Fantasy IX remake being in danger, and the reason I say that because I believe it was reported that there was like a post on Reset Era by a known leaker known Nate the Hate, who basically said the Final Fantasy IX remake project could be in trouble. But the thing is, Square Enix, I don't think, has gone on record and confirmed anything like that. And I'm certainly hoping that's not the case because a lot of people are expecting a remake for Final Fantasy IX this year. And if we don't get it this year, we should get it by 2026 at the latest. Because, you look back at Final Fantasy IX and it's kind of strange that for the most part, Square Enix has never really like done anything like big with it. I don't think we've ever gotten like a film adaptation or an anime or anything like that for Final Fantasy IX. They'll milk Final Fantasy VII out for all it's worth, and understandably so, because that was the best selling game within the franchise. And granted, we did get like ports for Final Fantasy 9, like, on the PS4, on the Nintendo Switch, and Xbox One. We never got an official remake, and I feel like, the game is long overdue for that. And even though, like, the characters are not as compelling or memorable as some of the characters in the other Final Fantasy games, I do feel like it's something that, Square Enix could profit off of. And Final Fantasy 9 is literally like the first major entry within the new millennium, and I feel like that's something that they should definitely they should acknowledge, and they should try to do something special with the original game, and I don't know, I'm not exactly sure why that would be problematic for Square Enix. And if they do decide to cancel it, I do feel like that's something that wouldn't be necessarily good on their end, because it's going to be a while before we get Final Fantasy 17, because Final Fantasy 16 came out back in 2023. And you look at Final Fantasy 15, that game came out back in, I want to say, 2016. So it's going to be a while before we get Final Fantasy 17. And in the meantime, they should definitely remake some of their older games, like, games from the 2000s, because I think they already remastered Final Fantasy X parts 1 and 2. And, I honestly feel like Final Fantasy 13 Part 1 and 2 should be considered for a remake as well, even though, those two games are not necessarily everyone's favorite. It's something that is more recent, and people remember Lightning from, Final Fantasy 13, even though she was not everyone's favorite character. People still know who she is. And I honestly feel like if Square Enix, took it upon themselves to revamp the gameplay for Final Fantasy 13, there's definitely money to be made, because having a game that's a turn-based RPG where you can only control one character opposed to a whole party is stupid, and they should have known that ahead of time before they released Final Fantasy 13. So maybe that's something that they can fix if they do a remake in the future. But honestly, I want to see a Final Fantasy 9 remake before we get a Final Fantasy 13 remake. And like I said, this is something that Square Enix has not confirmed yet. We don't know whether or not they plan on canceling the Final Fantasy 9 remake or not. I certainly hope that is not the case, and that we might get it like at a later time, like in 2016 or 2017. And and honestly, maybe even do like a anime or film adaptation of Final Fantasy 9, because it's something that a lot of people feel like has been overlooked for quite some time. And I don't know, maybe it's something that can help, I guess, get more eyes and more attention to that particular game. Draw in more casuals, reintroduce Final Fantasy 9 to the current generation of gamers, because back in the day, Square Enix was putting out some of their best games within the franchise. And honestly, I feel like there's money to be made off of games like Final Fantasy 9 and 10 and all that stuff that they can remake and do whatever with. And they can only milk Final Fantasy 7 out for so long before people get sick of it, or it just doesn't sell as much as they hope that it would. But yeah, I mean, scaling back on a Final Fantasy 9 remake would not be a good idea, especially considering the fact that Final Fantasy 7 is a long way off for its release. In fact, I wouldn't expect a Final Fantasy 7 game until like the PS6 comes out, but by that time, gaming in general might be unaffordable for the casual fan. But but yeah, I mean, honestly, a Final Fantasy 9 remake is something that I would like to see, and I'm pretty sure it's something that a lot of people within the gaming world would love to see in general.